Paris in the 1700s was already too large to control.
By the early 18th century, Paris had grown faster than its streets, markets, and systems could keep up. Down on the streets, the city felt tight and restless, with too many people moving through spaces never meant to hold them. Markets like this fed the city, but they also exposed its strain, where shortages, price rises, and tempers met face to face.
The city was loud and physical. Waste lay in the streets. Animals moved through crowds.
The conda. The river kept Paris moving. Food, fuel, and people passed through here every day. Bridges narrowed the city's movement, forcing crowds into tight spaces where tempers rose, and order was hard to keep. Keeping order in a city this crowded required constant presence, with patrols watching markets, bridges, and major streets. Behind these walls, space was limited. Families shared rooms, courtyards, and water.
Much of Paris worked by hand, in small shops and crowded rooms, where long hours were the only way to keep pace with demand.
Guilds controlled much of the city's labor, setting rules that protected standards, but also limited opportunity and kept many workers on the margins. In the same city, some lived behind stone facades and guarded doors, while others crowded into narrow streets where comfort was rare. For many Parisians, bread was never taken for granted. A poor harvest or rising prices could turn a routine purchase into a daily worry. When prices climbed faster than wages, anger did not erupt at once. It gathered slowly. In conversations, rumors spread quickly in a city this dense. News, truth, and fear often arrived together, carried by voices rather than ink. When unease grew, the city answered with presence. Patrols increased, corners were watched, and gatherings were quietly discouraged. At night, Paris changed. Lantern light replaced daylight, and every street felt narrower and less certain. Night sharpened the city's fears. Crime was harder to see, and trust was harder to find. To keep the city in check after dark, watchmen patrolled the streets, calling the hours and marking their presence.
Bells marked the hours and carried across the city, offering rhythm and reassurance in the dark.
By dawn, the city began again. Doors opened, fires were lit, and Paris returned to its daily rhythm. Morning belonged to work. Before most shops opened, carts moved, tools were gathered, and the city's labor quietly began.
By mid-morning, the markets returned to life. Goods arrived, prices were debated, and the city's daily exchange took shape.
Paris depended on constant movement. Streets and rivers carried food, fuel, and labor, binding the city together through motion. The riverfront was where Paris worked hardest. Supplies arrived by water, and every load had to be hauled by hand. Before reaching the streets, goods passed through storage and inspection, where supply was measured and control quietly exercised.
Movement brought profit, but not evenly. Taxes and tolls turned food and fuel into revenue long before they reached the people who needed them.
While the city labored, comfort gathered behind walls like these, where distance softened the noise and strain of everyday life. Churches shaped the city's rhythm, offering charity to the poor and moral authority that reached far beyond their walls. Education followed strict lines. Some children learned letters and numbers, while others were trained early for labor that would define their lives.
Decisions that shaped daily life were often made far from the street, recorded in ink and enforced through paper.
Law was not hidden away. Courts and judgments unfolded in public spaces, reminding the city where authority ultimately rested. Punishment was meant to be seen. By making examples in public, authorities reinforced order through fear and memory. Scenes like this lingered long after the crowd moved on, shaping behavior through memory rather than force. Life did not stop. It adjusted. The city returned to work, carrying the memory quietly as it moved on.
Weather shaped the rhythm of the city. Rain, cold, and rising water could slow movement and strain already fragile routines.
Crowded streets and poor sanitation made illness a constant threat, stretching hospitals and caregivers thin.
Death was woven into daily life. Burials and rituals offered order and meaning in a city where loss was never far away. By evening, the city slowed. Lamps were lit, doors closed, and Paris carried the weight of the day quietly into the night.
Night revealed a different Paris. Taverns filled with talk, drink, and ideas that rarely surfaced in daylight.
Behind closed doors, voices lowered. Grievances were shared carefully, carried by trust rather than volume. Night belonged to watchmen and patrols. Order was enforced through presence, light, and the knowledge of being seen. Arrests rarely drew attention. They were meant to be seen, just enough to remind the city where limits lay. Those taken at night often vanished from view. Confinement worked best when it was quiet and unseen.
Late at night, the city fell silent. What remained was absence calve, and the sense that Paris was never truly at rest.
Before dawn, light returned slowly. The city had rested just long enough to begin again. The rhythm continued, but strain accumulated. Each day added weight that did not disappear when night fell. Paris held more than one reality. Hardship and comfort existed within sight of one another, rarely crossing paths. Change rarely announced itself. It moved through words, glances, and shared understanding, spreading slowly through the city. Those in power noticed the shift. Not enough to act, but enough to watch carefully. To an outsider, Paris looked unchanged. Trade continued, conversations flowed, and the city carried on as it always had. Time moved differently in the city. Days repeated, years layered, and Paris carried its past forward without pause.
Strain eventually surfaced. Small disagreements carried more weight, and patience wore thinner than before.
Order was reinforced quietly. More eyes watched the streets, and rules were applied with less tolerance for deviation. Voices softened. Compliance replaced complaint, but frustration did not disappear buoyant. It simply went underground.
What could not be said in the street was shared in private. Frustration endured, protected by walls and whispered trust.
Separated voices began to align. In private, ideas found structure, shared meaning, and direction. Nothing appeared different, yet Paris was no longer the city it had been. Change had taken root where it could not be seen. Paris moved forward as it always had. But beneath familiar streets and routines, something permanent had begun to shift. The past feels distant until you realize it once breathed in the same streets. And in Paris, it never truly left. If you enjoyed this journey through London in the 1600s, let me know what stood out to you most in the comments.